What if the financial collapse of an empire does not begin with a market crash or a currency crisis, but with a silent pattern of fraud repeating itself across centuries, almost unchanged, as if history were running the same script under different flags? What if the fall of Egypt's financial dynasties, the implosion of Portugal's imperial wealth, and the erosion of India's colonial economy were not isolated tragedies, but chapters of the same seven-stage sequence that powerful nations keep, denying until it is already too late? And here is the unsettling question that opens this story. What if the United Kingdom, once the financial engine of the world, has already crossed the invisible threshold into stage 6 of this fraud pattern, where decline accelerates and deception becomes structural rather than accidental? This pattern begins quietly, with systems designed to look stable, while concealing deep fragilities beneath their polished surface. For centuries, empires believed they could outsmart economic gravity. Egypt manipulated grain reserves and temple treasuries until its economy became dependent on artificial abundance. Portugal flooded Europe with gold from Brazil, masking internal decay with a financial illusion that collapsed the moment the mines dried up. India, under colonial administration, was engineered to extract wealth rather than generate it, producing a monetary ecosystem that rewarded manipulation far more than productivity. Each believed they were in control. Each believed their financial architecture was immune to the vulnerabilities that destroyed civilizations before them. But the pattern advanced anyway, stage by stage, feeding on overconfidence and denial. And now, the United Kingdom finds itself in a similar position, balancing on a structure weakened by debt expansion, declining productive capacity, and monetary strategies that resemble the same mechanisms once used by empires that were certain collapse would never reach them. You can already see the early signals hiding behind official narratives, waiting for the public to notice the fractures forming under their feet, the kinds of fractures that always widen when a nation enters stage 6 of the cycle. This is where illusions turn into liabilities, where financial systems become dependent on the very distortions they once used to stay afloat, and where past empires discovered that momentum can no longer be reversed no matter how loudly leaders insist everything is under control. And as these parallels grow clearer, it becomes difficult to ignore how history is whispering the same warning it gave to every collapsing power before. Before we continue deeper, tell me something in the comments, because understanding this pattern matters more than ever. Have you ever felt that financial crises repeat themselves almost intentionally, as if someone benefits every time a system breaks? If this content resonates, leave your like and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss the next parts of this investigation, because what comes next will connect directly with the weaknesses that brought the UK to stage 6 and reveal why so many people never see the final collapse approaching until it is already unavoidable. When you begin tracing the origins of these recurring financial collapses, a striking pattern emerges long before any empire reaches its breaking point. Fraud does not suddenly appear in stage 6. It begins quietly, generations earlier, disguised as innovation, celebrated as progress, and defended as necessary for stability. In Egypt, the first cycles of manipulation took shape when grain reserves were adjusted to influence prices and maintain the illusion of abundance. Priestly elites understood that controlling the flow of resources meant controlling the population, and over time, this subtle distortion evolved into a structural tool of power. What looked like strategy was actually the seed of long-term fragility, one that hollowed out the economy while projecting strength. Portugal followed a similar trajectory centuries later, though its fraud took the form of external wealth rather than internal manipulation. As gold from Brazil poured into Lisbon, the empire experienced a surge of artificial prosperity that felt permanent. But easy riches created a financial mirage. Instead of strengthening productive sectors, Portugal relied on imported luxury, foreign manufacturing, and speculative spending. The fraudulent premise beneath this prosperity was the belief that infinite wealth could flow from finite sources, that the empire could keep consuming without building. The gold masked the decay until the mines weakened, and the illusion collapsed under its own weight. India's situation was different, yet followed the same blueprint. Under British colonial rule, the economy was engineered to extract maximum value with minimum investment. The appearance of efficient administration concealed an underlying structure built on currency manipulation, forced taxation, and deliberate suppression of local industries. The fraud here was more systemic, a financial ecosystem designed to look modern and orderly while siphoning wealth upward. This was not simple exploitation. It was a sophisticated architecture of distortion that trained the economy to depend on imbalances, leaving it weakened long before the world recognized the consequences. Across these empires, the fraud pattern took different shapes, but the logic remained identical. Prosperity built on manipulated foundations generates unearned confidence, and that confidence becomes the engine that drives the next stage. The more stable the system appears, the more aggressively decision-makers push it beyond its limits. Fraud becomes normalized, not because individuals intend to deceive, but because the system rewards behaviors that hide risk rather than confront it. It is in this early normalization that the real damage begins because, once a nation becomes dependent on distortion to maintain the appearance of strength, the cycle is already in motion, quietly preparing the ground for the deeper fractures that come next. As this hidden cycle advances, the mechanics of manipulation evolve from simple distortions into a structured financial architecture that becomes almost impossible for ordinary citizens to detect. What begins as temporary adjustments eventually transforms into a permanent framework where money, credit, and value no longer reflect the real strength of the economy, but the priorities of those who control its levers. In ancient Egypt, the priestly elite used grain stores not merely as provisions, but as a primitive monetary system. By strategically releasing or withholding grain, they could influence prices, wages, and the perceived health of the kingdom. This was not seen as fraud in their time. It was framed as necessary stewardship. Yet beneath the surface, the manipulation allowed a small group to shape the economy around their own interests, slowly disconnecting value from production. Portugal faced a similar shift once gold became the foundation of its financial identity. As foreign wealth poured in, the monarchy and merchant elites discovered that they could maintain social order not through investment or innovation, but through redistribution of imported riches. Speculation replaced productivity. Imports replaced manufacturing, and the monetary system relied less on internal strength and more on the illusion of limitless supply. What appeared to be prosperity was actually dependency, and that dependency distorted every layer of the economy. Inflation rose, local industries collapsed, and the currency lost credibility long before the empire realized the structural damage had already taken root. Under British rule, India encountered a more advanced and calculated version of this monetary disconnect. Colonial administrators manipulated silver and rupee valuations, extracted taxes in forms that benefited the empire, and imposed trade rules that drained local liquidity. The financial system was arranged to funnel resources outward while giving the impression of a stable administrative state. Over time, the currency became a tool not for domestic prosperity, but for maintaining imperial control. It no longer reflected the productive capacity of the region. It reflected the needs of the colonial government. This made the economy appear functional while weakening the very foundations that would have supported long-term resilience. Across all these examples, the true danger was not the manipulation itself, but the normalization of it. Once a nation's monetary system is built around distortions, every subsequent decision reinforces the same logic. Production becomes secondary to perception. Political narratives replace economic reality, and the value of money gradually drifts away from the value of what a country actually produces. By the time the pattern becomes visible to the public, the underlying structure has already transformed into something brittle, dependent on continuous intervention and increasingly vulnerable to collapse. As these distortions accumulate, a familiar turning point emerges, one that every empire believes it can avoid but never does. It is the moment when manipulation stops being a temporary response and becomes the operating principle of the entire financial system. At this stage, leaders no longer correct imbalances. They justify them. They no longer rebuild productive capacity. They substitute it with narratives of resilience and stability. The pattern that destroyed Egypt's granary economy, weakened Portugal's imperial wealth, and hollowed out India's colonial infrastructure begins to accelerate, feeding on its own momentum and erasing the line between policy and deception. For Egypt, this meant controlling grain reserves so aggressively that the market lost any connection to real agricultural output. Prices no longer reflected harvests. They reflected decisions made in temples and storage houses. The system functioned as long as the harvests were strong, but when drought disrupted the cycle, the illusion shattered instantly, revealing how dependent the kingdom had become on artificial balance. Portugal experienced a similar revelation when its economy, built on foreign gold, faced declining shipments. Without the constant inflow of wealth, everything built upon it cracked at once. Industries that should have anchored the economy had been neglected, and the financial structure had no ability to absorb shock. The collapse was not sudden. It only looked sudden because the fraud had been hidden for so long. In India, the pattern played out through currency manipulation and extraction. The British administration created an economic ecosystem that was stable only as long as extraction continued at predictable levels. When global markets shifted or local resistance disrupted the flow, the system's fragility became impossible to hide. A monetary structure designed to benefit distant financiers could not withstand the internal pressures building beneath its surface. What looked like administrative efficiency disintegrated once its underlying assumptions were challenged. This is the stage where every empire begins repeating the same errors with unwavering confidence. Instead of scaling back manipulation, leaders expand it. Instead of acknowledging structural weaknesses, they double down on policies that accelerate decline. They tell themselves they are managing a temporary imbalance, even as the system becomes dependent on ever larger distortions. And this is precisely how the pattern advances to the threshold of collapse, through denial disguised as strategy. Before we move forward, tell me something in the comments. Have you noticed how modern economies often rely on narratives rather than genuine strength, repeating the same cycle that once consumed entire empires? As the pattern deepens, a quieter, but more dangerous transformation begins to unfold. The erosion of productive capacity. This stage is always subtle at first, because it is masked by the appearance of stability. Empires rarely realize they have entered this phase until the damage is irreversible. Egypt believed its grain system was strong because reserves looked full, forgetting that reserves filled by manipulation do not reflect actual agricultural resilience. When environmental pressures arrived, the illusion of abundance collapsed and exposed how dependent the economy had become on centralized control rather than genuine output. Portugal suffered a similar fate as its industries withered under the weight of imported luxury and easy foreign wealth. Gold created a comfortable buffer that allowed the empire to ignore the decay spreading through its productive sectors. Workshops closed, local artisans vanished, and essential industries were replaced by foreign suppliers. Prosperity became a performance sustained by spending rather than creation. When gold shipments slowed, the empire discovered that its economic core had been hollowed out by decades of neglect. What remained was a shell that could no longer support the demands of an imperial structure. In colonial India, the dynamic was even more engineered. Productive sectors were deliberately distorted to serve imperial interests. Domestic industries capable of competing with British manufacturing were taxed, restricted, or dismantled. The result was an economy that produced abundance only in areas that benefited the colonial administration. Everything else was pushed into stagnation. Over time, entire regions lost the ability to sustain themselves independently, creating long-term structural damage that remained even after colonial control ended. This loss of productive strength is not an accident of history. It is part of the fraud pattern itself. When a system becomes dependent on financial manipulation, speculative wealth, or extraction, genuine production becomes less profitable and less prioritized. Investments shift towards sectors that reward distortion over innovation. Policies favor short-term gains rather than long-term development. The economic engine weakens slowly, almost invisibly, because the outward markers of prosperity still appear intact. But beneath the surface, the capacity to withstand shocks, sustain growth, and generate independent wealth erodes year after year. By the time the cracks become visible, the foundation has already fractured. The system no longer generates enough real output to support its commitments, yet it continues expanding obligations as if the underlying strength were unchanged. This internal contradiction is what pushes empires toward the next stage of the sequence, where the impact of their past choices becomes unavoidable, and the illusion of control begins to break apart. By the time an empire reaches the sixth stage of this pattern, the warning signs are no longer hidden in economic reports or isolated crises, they begin to define the national reality. This stage is not marked by a single dramatic collapse, but by a gradual acknowledgement that the financial system now depends more on distortion than on production. For the United Kingdom, this shift became unmistakable as its economic structure started mirroring the same weaknesses that once brought Egypt, Portugal, and India to the edge of collapse. The country continued to project stability through its financial sector, yet beneath that polished surface, the foundations were weakening at a pace few wanted to admit. The UK long relied on its reputation as a global financial hub, a place where capital flowed confidently and institutions appeared resilient. But as manufacturing declined and the economy shifted heavily toward services, the nation began exhibiting the classic symptoms of Stage 6: rising dependency on external inputs, vulnerability to global shocks, and a currency increasingly influenced by policy decisions rather than productive strength. Economic narratives emphasized resilience, yet productivity stagnated, wages failed to keep pace with inflation, and public debt ballooned. The financial sector, once a source of national power, became a reflection of imbalance, growing in size while disconnecting from the real economy that sustained it. What makes Stage 6 so dangerous is that it blends denial with necessity. Leaders cannot reverse the manipulations that kept the system afloat because the economy has become dependent on them. Each intervention requires a larger one to maintain the illusion of stability. The UK reached this phase when monetary policy moved from being a tool of adjustment to a mechanism of survival. Interest rates swung sharply, not to encourage growth, but to control crises created by earlier interventions. Public services strained under budget pressures, and the currency experienced volatility that would have once been unthinkable for a former imperial financial center. Meanwhile, the outward symbols of strength continued to mask the internal weaknesses, just as they did in the empires that came before. Investors still saw London as a global capital. Politicians still spoke of influence and stability. But underneath, the economic engine struggled to generate the output needed to support these claims. Imports grew faster than exports, domestic industries weakened, and the country became more reliant on financial engineering than on tangible production. This is the hallmark of Stage 6. When a nation believes it is managing a temporary imbalance, even as the structure has already begun shifting under its feet. The same pressures that once dismantled older empires now quietly converge on the UK, setting the stage for the pattern's final progression. At this point in the pattern, the signs of decline are no longer theoretical. They become visible in everyday life, in the way prices shift, unpredictably, in the way public services strain under growing pressure, and in the way institutions that once projected confidence now seem reactive, defending themselves rather than shaping the future. The United Kingdom, like the empires before it, has reached a moment where structural weakness is no longer disguised by financial narratives. Instead, those narratives begin to sound repetitive, almost rehearsed, as if their primary purpose is to reassure rather than inform. This is the defining feature of Stage 6. When a nation's confidence becomes a story it tells itself, not a reality it can demonstrate. The erosion of trust is one of the clearest indicators. Investors who once saw British assets as safe havens now price in risks that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Currency markets move sharply in response to policy announcements, revealing how sensitive the system has become to even modest disruptions. Households feel the shift as inflation eats into wages, making everyday expenses heavier and long-term planning harder. These pressures do not come from a single source. They emerge from the cumulative weight of decisions made over decades, decisions that slowly replaced productive capacity with financial leverage and external dependence. Institutions, too, begin to show the strain, whether in the form of political volatility, public sector backlogs, or contentious economic debates. The symptoms reflect a system stretched beyond its natural limits. Leaders attempt to stabilize the situation with narratives of resilience, But these assurances resemble the final years of past empires, when confidence was defended more fiercely than the underlying economy. In Egypt, this stage meant grain shortages disguised by administrative decrees. In Portugal, it meant insisting on prosperity long after the gold economy cracked. In India, it meant administrative order projected over a system already unstable beneath the surface. The UK shows the same pattern, the language of stability used more often than the evidence of it. Yet the most telling sign of Stage 6 is the sense of inevitability that grows quietly among the population. People may not articulate it, but they feel it. They sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the old assurances no longer hold the weight they once did. This collective intuition is not irrational. It is the final warning that the pattern is accelerating toward its next stage, just as history has shown, time and time again. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you noticed these subtle shifts in confidence and stability? The kind that suggest a deeper transformation happening beneath the surface? As the pattern moves forward, the consequences of a weakened financial core no longer remain contained within national borders. Stage 6 does not simply destabilize the empire at its center, it sends ripples through the entire global system connected to it. This is where the decline of a major financial power becomes more than an internal issue. It becomes a catalyst for worldwide uncertainty. For the United Kingdom, a nation whose financial sector once shaped global commerce, the implications of reaching this phase extend far beyond its own economic boundaries. The weakening of its currency, the strain on its institutions, and the erosion of productive capacity create vulnerabilities that international markets cannot ignore. History shows that when an empire slips into Stage 6, global actors begin repositioning themselves. In Egypt's era, neighboring regions adapted to shortages and shifts in trade routes as confidence in the kingdom dwindled. Portugal's decline reconfigured power across Europe, altering alliances and opening doors for new competitors. India's financial unraveling under colonial influence contributed to broader changes in global trade that reshaped entire continents. In each case, the fall of a financial center weakened surrounding economies, disrupted established networks, and forced external powers to adjust their strategies. The UK's position in the modern world makes this ripple effect even more pronounced. London remains a global financial hub, not because of its manufacturing strength, but because of its long-standing reputation as a stable marketplace. When that stability falters, the effects spread quickly across currency markets, investment flows, and trade relationships. As volatility increases, partners who once relied on the UK as a financial anchor begin diversifying to protect themselves. Some shift reserves into alternative currencies. Others redirect investments toward markets perceived as more resilient. This gradual realignment mirrors the slow but decisive transitions that accompanied previous imperial declines. Moreover, the UK's interconnectedness means that its internal struggles amplify global uncertainty. Supply chains reliant on British financial services face new risks. Nations tied to the pound experience heightened exposure during periods of currency fluctuation. Even geopolitical alliances feel the strain, as economic fragility limits the UK's influence on international negotiations. These developments do not occur overnight, but they accumulate, creating an environment where global actors no longer view the UK as a stabilizing force, but as a variable that must be managed. This shift in perception marks a critical threshold in the fraud pattern. When confidence in an empire's economic foundation weakens internationally, the pattern accelerates. External pressure compounds internal fragility, pushing the system closer to the point where even small disruptions can trigger disproportionately large consequences. And as history has shown repeatedly, once this stage is reached, the path toward the final phase becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. As the pattern tightens around a declining empire, one realization becomes unavoidable. Once Stage 6 is reached, Stage 7 is no longer a distant threat but a mathematical consequence. Every empire that entered this phase believed it still had time. Every empire insisted it could reform, recalibrate, or recover. Yet history leaves no exceptions. The moment financial stability depends on continuous manipulation, external confidence erodes, and productive strength collapses, the cycle shifts from slow decay to rapid unraveling. Egypt discovered this when grain reserves failed to mask shortages. Portugal learned it when foreign gold could no longer subsidize its structural weakness. India experienced it when the financial architecture sustaining colonial extraction began to fracture under global and internal pressures. In each case, the transition from strain to collapse was far faster than leaders expected. Stage 7 is not triggered by a single dramatic event. It is the result of accumulating contradictions finally converging. Debt grows faster than national income. Currency interventions become more frequent and less effective. Political factions turn inward, each blaming the other for systemic failures that have been decades in the making. And as these tensions build, even small shocks can have outsized effects. Egypt faced drought. Portugal faced declining mining yields. India encountered global market disruptions. None of these alone were catastrophic, but combined with the structural weaknesses already in place, they accelerated the descent. The United Kingdom now stands at this precipice. The symptoms mirror those of the past with unsettling precision. Productivity continues to lag behind global competitors. The pound experiences volatility tied less to market fundamentals and more to policy improvisation. Public debt rises even during periods that should offer fiscal stability, signaling that the system is no longer capable of self-correction. Meanwhile, political divisions deepen, revealing the strain of managing a financial architecture increasingly dependent on intervention rather than resilience. These are not isolated problems. They are the markers of a system preparing to transition into the final stage of the pattern. What history shows is that once confidence weakens internally and externally, collapse does not unfold gradually. It accelerates. Expectations shift. Markets reposition. Households adjust behavior. Institutions tighten or fragment under pressure. The system, already fragile, becomes vulnerable to chain reactions that would have been manageable in earlier stages. This is why no empire has reversed course once it entered stage 6. The momentum becomes self-reinforcing. Egypt's collapse unfolded rapidly after centuries of slow decline. Portugal's imperial structure deteriorated within a few decades. India's financial unraveling under colonial administration escalated swiftly once pressure mounted. The UK's trajectory now aligns with this same historical arc, showing how the final transformation begins long before the public recognizes the full scale of the shift. As the cycle reaches its final turn, what unfolds is not a sudden catastrophe, but the cumulative outcome of every distortion, every ignored warning, and every structural imbalance that has been building for years. Stage 7 does not announce itself loudly. It emerges through small cracks that widen into fractures, through policies that once stabilized the system but now deepen its fragility, through expectations that shift almost imperceptibly, until confidence gives way. In past empires, this phase arrived when the mechanisms designed to preserve stability began accelerating decline instead. Egypt's grain decrees lost their influence. Portugal's gold inflows no longer offset structural weakness. India's administrative grip weakened as the financial system beneath it unraveled. Each collapse appeared abrupt to those living through it, yet the pattern shows it was the inevitable culmination of forces long in motion. For the United Kingdom, reaching this stage means entering a period where resilience depends less on strategic decisions and more on how long the system can withstand pressure it was never built to manage. The currency becomes increasingly reactive, shifting in response to global movements rather than domestic strength. Institutions face rising strain as demands outpace capacity, and policies stabilizing one sector create disruptions in another. Social expectations shift as households recognize that the certainty they once relied on is no longer supported by the economic foundation beneath them. This subtle shift in collective mindset is often the final indicator that the system is approaching irreversible transformation. Across history, the most telling moment in Stage 7 is when nations attempt to reclaim control through intensified intervention. They adjust interest rates sharply, implement emergency measures, or introduce narratives promising renewed stability. Yet these actions reveal the underlying truth. The system has entered a state where its internal contradictions can no longer be contained. The machinery that once projected confidence now struggles to maintain coherence, much like the final years of every empire that followed this same trajectory. And as these pressures converge, the pattern accelerates. Not because collapse is imminent in a single moment, but because the structure supporting the system has already drifted beyond the point where recovery follows. Predictable rules. If you've reached this point, it means you value understanding the deeper forces shaping global financial cycles, and that connection matters. Before you move on, tell me in the comments that you're here until the end with something simple like "I am here until the end," or "This message reached me." Your voice helps expand conversations that most people never fully explore. And if this journey through the 7-stage pattern brought clarity, consider subscribing to stay connected with content that continues unraveling the hidden mechanics behind global economic shifts. Leave your like if this narrative resonated with you. And when you're ready, there's another video waiting that builds naturally on what we explored here. Click on the one beside this screen and continue the investigation with me, following the thread of history as it reveals what comes next.